Hi, I'm George. Welcome to GMakes, and this is how to become the Sorcerer Supreme and make portals, Doctor Strange portals, in Blender. So let's get right into it. Alright, so this is the final effect that we're going to be making. Just look at how it looks in the render, the viewport, rather. And basically there's two sections to this tutorial. First, we're going to make this inner ring using geometry nodes, and then we're going to make these outer particles, which are how you get like those little sparks. The reason why I'm doing it this way is because it's a fully particle effect, I believe, in the actual movies and everything, but watching it back, there's like a thicker ring often in the middle just of like particles that then spins out into the sparks. And just using the particle system in Blender, it's hard to get that thicker ring and like that substance, so we're gonna fake it with geometry nodes. We're gonna make actual particles, but we're gonna also make particles. So let's get into it. Let's make a new project, new general. I'll save, always save. And now I'm going to delete this light because I don't need it, but I'm going to keep this cube and our camera. So first thing, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new panel, and I'm going to go to Geometry Nodes Editor, and I'm going to hit New. I'll name this like Portal Nodes. And now the basis for this is a circle, a curved circle. I mean, it's a circle. My initial way of doing this was with a curved spiral, which also works. And it's I was using that because I was using it as a quick and dirty way to animate it opening and then reopening. But like just changing the endpoints, making it a spiral with no height. But I found a better way to do it with a circle. So we're going to use a circle. Now I'm just grabbing a transform node because I want this to look at me. So along the x-axis, we're going to hit 90. There we go. And now we can see it. Perfect. Now we can actually see what we're working with. It's not on the floor. We're going to make this some geometry because we want to instance some points on this. So I'm going to get a curve to mesh. Curve to mesh. Right there. And now I'm going to copy this curved circle and use that as our profile curve. And you can also fill caps if you want. Not going to really see them unless you do the animation thing, which I'm going to briefly go over for opening and closing this portal. Radius, I'm going to set to like 0.01. That's maybe a little thin. Let's do 0.5. That's way too thick. 0.1. We'll stick with 0.1. 0.1. So this is our basis of a portal. Yay! Couple of things before we get further. I want to grab a resample curve, and I'm going to bump this to like 100. Just because you can change the resolution, but this I also want to change the length. I'll add a little more variation, a little more randomness. One side's a little smoother, a little more rough on the other side. We're going to use this length measurement again in just a minute, so, you know, why not? Again, not wholly, you don't have to do this, but I like it. Add some more variation. So now, to control the thickness of this as it goes around, because that portal also has a little bit of a wibble wobble to it. So we're going to change, we want some variance, some variation. So I'm going to grab a set curve radius, plug that in there, and now we can change this radius as it goes along. So to make this random, we are going to use a random value. Pretty straightforward, so we're going to grab a random value node and plug that right in there. And there we go, that's the gist of it. But we want to control these min and max values a little bit more. If you don't want to animate it at all, like opening or closing, go ahead and just use those values. You can keep it there. But I want to at least go over how, or at least one way to animate this opening and closing, because you know it like starts and then it spirals out, whatever. So to control that a little bit, we're going to grab a spline parameter. It used to be called a curve parameter. Not spline, cyclic. Curve or a spline parameter. This basically says you can use this to control like how wide something gets as it goes along, like a spiral or something. In one of my first tutorials, my Christmas tree tutorial, I use it to control like as the spiral of the Christmas tree goes towards the point, it gets thinner, and as it gets to the bottom, it gets thicker. But that was a curve parameter. Now it's called spline parameter, and there's a couple more options. We are just going to grab the length though, plug that into both our max and our minimum. And now you can see that effect where at the minimum it goes until it gets to the max, or the length of it, so like from 0 to 1. But we want to control this, so I'm going to grab a math node, and we're going to plug that in, and make sure that plugs both into the min and the max. And now we're going to change this to one of these comparisons. I like greater than, though less than or comparison work. And now you can see, as I change this threshold value, it animates it opening and closing. I mean, that's it. It goes whoop, it opens. Then you can also change the size of the radius to animate it like getting bigger. But we want a little more, we want that variation back in here. So I'm going to grab some more math nodes. I'm just going to duplicate that first math node, plug it in, and change this to multiply. And I'll grab another one, copy that, put it down, and now we can see the min and max values. We want these to be positive, but you're just multiplying. And I generally find you want your minimum to be like half the size of your maximum. We'll keep it there for now. I kind of like that, 0.3, 0.6. These are another values you can mess with. I mean, this part of it's procedural, so find what looks right to you. And there we go. We got some noise. We got some randomness. I'm going to add even a little bit more randomness by grabbing a scene time node and plugging my frames into that seed. So now as we hit play, you can see it's not even rotating yet, and it already looks like it's rotating just because it's changing the thickness so much. But we do want this to rotate because we're going to use that for our particles. So in this transform, I'm going to make sure my settings are correct, so I'm going to go to 30 frames per second, which is what I like because you can get a lot of motion blur. It's pretty common. My camera uses 30 FPS. I just like 30 FPS, but you choose what you want to do. If you get higher than that, like 60 or something, you might lose some motion blur, and that's a very important part of this effect, so I wouldn't recommend it. But we're going to keep this, and we're going to now change this transform. I'm just going to animate like 3 seconds, so I'm just going to do 90 frames. And I found like the slowest you want to go is about 1 rotation, so 360 degrees per second. So like 1 RPS, I guess. That's just what I'm going to do right now to keep math simple. So I'm going to go in my Y rotation, because that's controlling that one. I'm going to go 3 times 360, and that will give me 1080. And that's how much it's rotated. I'm going to go to my last frame. I'm going to hit I on that keyframe. And I'm going to go to my first frame, go back to 0, hit I, and now it's both rotating and it also gets the motion from the spline parameter and the greater than node. And also the scene frames, all that jazz. So there we go. That's the basis of it. That's our base mesh. And now we want to add some particles, both particles and actual Blender particles. So let's start with particles. After this curve to mesh, we are going to grab a distribute. Points on faces. Woo, look at that. And you kind of need an absurd amount of particles here, of points rather. So I'm just gonna bump that up to 10,000. Look at that. That's so many. It's solid at this point. It's about to get crazier, just because of how instancing works. So maybe I'll keep that down for a moment. I'll go back to it. I'll go to 1,000 because I'm going to grab an instance on points, not realize instances. I'll keep that for later. But an instance on points. Plug that in, and then for our instance, we are just going to grab an icosphere because everybody loves an icosphere. Woo! Look at it, beautiful. I'm gonna make it real small, 0.01 maybe. There we go. You can see now we got some like particles. And now I want to add a little variation to this scale, however, so I'm going to grab another lovely random value node, plug that in, and settings, I'm going to do again half, so 0.5. 1 is going to be whatever size your icosphere is, so if you haven't changed that, you might want to change that size, or the max value. But there we go, particles. So now I'm going to up this density from 100, I guess I did, to 10, 1, 2, 3, 10,000. And that's our particles. That's maybe a little lot for now, so I'll go 5,000. There we go. And there we go, we got particles. Woo, particles. And now last thing before I move on to the actual particles, out of these particles, is I'm going to get a set material and just put that on our base material. All right, so that's basic. The basic gist, we got these fake particles that spin and look like our central ring. So let's get actual particles. Let's use Blender's particle system, everybody's favorite thing. Not definitely what Geometry Nodes was made to replace a lot of, but to use it, we are going to duplicate this mesh. So select it, Shift D, right click so it doesn't move. I'm going to rename these to Portal, and then this one to Portal Particles. There we go, Portal Particles. That's a tongue twister if I ever heard one. Now we do want this geometry node set up, but we don't want all of it. So to copy over all my animation stuff, I'm actually going to make sure I have Portal Particles selected, and then I'm just going to hit this button, Copy Geometry Node Group. And there we go. So now you can see they both are using different geometry nodes. Like if I mute one here, it does not mute it in the second one. But that's just copied it over, but I don't need everything. I don't need the distributed points. You can use particle system with distributed points from a geometry node group. You just have to realize those instances, which I've done in this one, but I just want the base geometry, that base mesh we made. So everything after distribute points and faces, I'm just going to Control X, cut it out. And there we go. Now we got our base mesh and our particle, our particle mesh as well. So let's make sure we have Portal Particles selected, and we're going to add a particle system to it. And there we go. And now, not very exciting. And that is because of a couple things. First, let's quickly just mess with the settings, kind of going down the order. So number, again, you need an absurd number of particles for this effect. I think my final, or like testing, I was using like 200,000, and even that maybe wasn't enough. We'll just go with 100,000 to prove a point. And the point is, it doesn't actually influence your computer too much. It doesn't affect it because lifetime is going to be 2. So you're not having 100,000 particles on your screen at once. You're only having whatever math that is on your screen at once. 5 might be the most, like the longest I'd let these particles live. I found 2 looks pretty good. But 5 might be the max, but I'm just going to do 2 for now. Lifetime end, I'm only going to 90, so I'm just going to add a little more past that just to keep them going. Frame start 1, perfect. And now if I hit play, nothing happens. Why? Not only because now they're dying real quick, so they don't move anywhere, but because we have a couple other important settings. First, source, I want this to be from my volume. And then, very importantly, use modifier stack. Now they're from our geometry nodes. If you don't click that, it just uses the cube. But we want the geometry nodes, and there we go, 10,000 particles, or 100,000 particles coming out of the volume. So great. But let's do a little bit more, all right? Let's get these flying off of this ring. So down here in velocity, normal, I'm going to move that to 0. Don't need it because the only setting we need down here is object velocity all the way up to 1. And now before I hit play for this, I'm going to Control S, save, and maybe name this like strange portal tut. Subscribe. You should subscribe for more if you want tutorials like this moderately consistently. And if you have any ideas for other tutorials or comments or questions, leave them in the comments below. Now let's get on to particles. So now these particles have the object velocity, so as it whips around, as it spins, which is why we copied all those geometry nodes as well, so we had the animation of it spinning, they're going to fly off tangentially. They're going to get spawned and then fly off with that velocity. So if we go back and we play this, you can see there they go. It's hard to see, but once we instance an object as this, it'll be much more obvious. So let's go down to render settings. And make sure you have physics turned on. It's a default, but you can also multiply mass with size, but these are small enough you don't really need to. So we're going to render as an object. What object? Well, let's make it. So Shift A, mesh, icosphere again. Woo, everyone loves an icosphere. We're going to go down to 1 because I don't need all that geometry. And then we'll just move it off to the side. And now I'll scale it down a bit. I'll apply that scale. Maybe move it a little bit more. And I'll also now click back over and this is the object we are going to render. So go into portal particles and down to object, and we're going to select our icosphere. And there we go, look at that. Now because I scaled that icosphere itself and applied the scale, I can use object scale, and then I can it will be a little bit smaller off the bat. If you don't do that, it'll probably be a little too large. But I like that size, 0.05, and I'll maybe give a little bit of object variation. And also you want to make sure in the render settings, show emitter, and in the viewport display, you can turn off the emitter as well. And there we go. So now we have our ring and we'll have our particles. If I go back and hit play, we have particles, and you can see 10,000 or 100,000 is still not a lot, but I'll keep it up there for now just to keep things going quickly. And again, I'm keeping these particles small. My first instinct was to make them larger so that they're easier to see, but watching back all the videos and movies and everything, they are pretty like thin little particles that just shoot off, so I'm gonna keep them small. Anyway, we have particles now. Woo! Last, I guess, or second to last, because we still got to texture this boy, is we are going to go to cache, and we're just going to bake our particles. This is especially important if you want to do physics and you have like a floor or something you want it to hit on. If you do that, not at like a bar, but like you want the particles to hit, like bounce off. Before you bake your particles, make sure you have that floor in place, and then go to forces and then deflection. And then you want to hit, you can do size deflect, that just means the bigger the particle, the more it's going to deflect, up to you. But then just choose the collision collection where your objects are and make sure those objects have collision, the physics property. So you go here and you hit collision for those objects. And there we go, then your particles will have collision, then you bake out your particle system and they should be bouncing off everything. But here we go, we have particles. Lovely, let's take a quick look at how this renders. So not really changing any render settings right now. I'm going to render this out in Eevee. You can do cycles. Eevee just looks good because it's got bloom built in. If you're going to render these with an alpha, it's kind of funky and weird, so there's other ways to do it. It's better to comp them in your shot in Blender, or export them as like, and then use this with a black background, and then use screen, or use like a Luma mat or something like that. But anyway, let's go ahead, set up our camera real quick. Go to view, camera to view. Let's just get a quick look at this boy. There we go. And let's see how it looks with no shading, no light, no anything. Yeah, not very interesting, but you can see we got that central ring. And we got the little particles, but they don't look like anything. They just look like little gray blobs. So let's fix that. First thing, we're going to go go to our portal rather, just our normal one. We're going to open up the shader editor. We've already set the material in our geometry nodes, so that's all we have to do. And I'll go up, and we're going to switch to shader editor. We are going to, since we're in Eevee, we're going to use an emission shader. If you're in cycles, just stick with the BSDF, or you can use an emission too, it doesn't really matter, but we're going to use an emission shader because we're in Eevee. I'm going to bump this up to like 20. We're going to go to material preview, and there we go, we got some shiny stuff, but it's just white. There we go, we're going to make this a little orangey, and yeah, you could do that. But like in the movies, I've noticed that like the edges of it, the inner and outer diameter edge, whatever you want to call it, is more orange. It's like cooler than the middle, which is like more white hot. So to emulate that, because I think that's a very important look that's often missed with a lot of these effects, is we are going to grab a wave texture. Bada bing, color. That's not what we want. So we're actually going to grab a color ramp as well. I'm just going to do the output for now. And now we're going to change this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to change this first to Y as bands. And there we go. You can see we got the bands we want, but we just want one. So we're going to put that scale down way low. And maybe even 0.2. 0.2, 0.1 usually looks good. The distortion is going to change where that lies. Let's go back to 0.1. So if we change that distortion and make that more or less in the middle, there you can see we kind of have a gradient. That's a little bit variation. It's not perfect, but I don't want it to be perfect. I don't need it to be perfect. So let's dial that in just a little bit. We want it right about there. Perfect. All right, there we go. I'll save. And now we have a black and white portal, which I guess is cool. Like if we go the emission here, like that's actually a pretty cool effect. But I want something a little bit better, a little bit more dynamic. So the black section of this is going to be, and we can even modify this a little bit, and we can even change the distortion again. The black section of this is going to be my darker color, my red, and the white section is going to be my lighter color, my whitish yellow. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna grab, make this lighter, and then just grab like an orangey red, and then grab a yellow orange for my light color. And there we go. And now we can really modify how that picks up and where it goes. And I also recommend doing a middle color that's somewhere in between the two. Perfect. And now you can really, again, mess with this scale. And you can really dial in this look. I'm trying not to spend too much time on this because that's something I really like doing. Yeah, distortion, Y, bands. There we go. Perfect. And I want this to be even more. A little darker. All right. And now let's see how that looks with emission. So I'm going to my material. You can also see this in material preview. I'm just going to my shader, my viewport shading. And we're going to go to render settings and go to bloom. And there we go. Now we really got that look going on. And we can even hit play. Look at that. Yeah, look at that. Look at that. Beautiful. And now last things last, I guess. Yes, besides our render settings is we want to also grab a particle. Add a new, the one that we're using to render our particles, our instance object. I'll change this to particle, and we're going to grab another emission shader with 1M. Emission, there. I'm going to go back to my portal, grab that darkest color of reddish orange. Maybe I want this a little more red. Grab that color and paste that into our emission. And we want to make it a little bit brighter and a little bit more orangey. I just want to use it as a base. And we'll make that like 20. These are all things you can dial in on your own. I'm just kind of quickly going through them from what I remember. But there we go. So now we got our portal. But you'll see if I go up and I hit render image, we're going to get a glowing thing. But it looks not like a portal. It just looks like a cool halo with stuff. So let's fix that. So the only setting we really need to mess with is motion blur. I'm also going to color management. I'm going to change this to high contrast. You can also change it to standard if you want a little bit more of that, like that's how it looks standard. I like filmic. I like a little bit more of that soft glow. But standard, if you're having weird issues with like the particles not quite looking blurred enough, filmic or standard might help with that. But we're going to go to motion blur. I find that for Eevee, center on frame or end on frame looks pretty good. I'm going to choose end on frame. If you're on cycles, I would say center on frame looks the best, at least from what I saw. And then we're going to change the steps to 16. This shutter is how, over a course of a frame, how much like it intakes the motion blur, if that makes sense. Where 1 is 1 frame, 0 is 0% of the frame. So 50.5, 50%. I think looks pretty good. If your trails are too short, you can make this value longer. If your trails are too long, you can make them shorter. You can also change the time that your particles are alive from like 2 to 5 is another way to mess with that. But I'm going to keep it at 0.5. And now, if I quickly save, and if we go to render and render image, we should see the motion blur. And we should see some particles. Look at that, beautifully shooting out. Colors, again, you can maybe comp in a couple different colors and really work and dial in your colors and your glow. But that's the portal. So that's it. That's been this tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've been George. I hope you learned something. I hope now you go out and find some new places, make some portals, travel to distant lands. Anyway, until next time, I'll catch you later. Bye.